Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Dolinsky. On behalf of the Association of American Colleges and Universities and the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on sampling in the MSc pilot study. This webinar is intended for all participants in the Multistate Collaborative to Advance Learning Outcomes Assessment Project and may be most useful to institutional point persons for the pilot study, assessment directors, and faculty members at institutions participating in the MSc pilot study. Today's webinar follows our recently scheduled webinars describing the MSc pilot, the pilot study, and assignment design, and will focus on the establishment of a sampling process and a sampling protocol at the MSc pilot institutions. Before we proceed with the webinar, allow me to discuss a few technical points. We currently have all participants muted to reduce background noise. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the Q&A chat function at any time during the webinar and send questions directly to the host and presenters. And we will post your question once the webinar panelists have completed their presentation. Please send any technical questions directly to the host of the webinar, Manka Nguasu, and she can chat with you directly. This session is being recorded and will be posted so that others may review it. Please let us know if you wish to ask a question off the record. Marco, we can now move to the next slide so we can start the introductions. Thank you. I would like to now introduce our panelists for the MSc webinar on sampling. Ashley Finley, Senior Director of Assessment and Research at AAC&U, and Bonnie Orcutt, Director of Learning Outcomes Assessment at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. Also present are Peter Ewell, Vice President at the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, Gary Pike, Director of Information Management and Institutional Research and a Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at IUPUI, and Katie Zabak, Senior Policy Analyst at SHIO. Peter, Gary, and Katie are available to help answer questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So I would like to now turn the webinar over to Ashley and Bonnie.
Hi, everyone. This is Ashley Finley at AAC&U. And thanks so much for taking the time this afternoon to join us for this and be part of the overall project. I want to extend a thanks as well to Becky Dolinsky and Manka Nguasu over here at AAC&U for helping us put the webinar together and just being such terrific co-conspirators and facilitators on this. It's really helpful. Bonnie and I have tried to lay out a game plan for the webinar, and our real hope with this, I think, along with all of the other webinars that we're offering, is as best we can to peel back the layers of a pretty complex project, and as much as possible with a project of this size and scope, to be in contact with you all as much as possible, to provide a forum and spaces in which we can answer your questions, spaces where we can help manage the delivery of content and expectations, and I hope open some lines of communication. I think one of the most helpful things from these webinars is simply having follow-up email conversations with folks that have joined us. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that, and certainly with this one particular topic that has quite a lot of details, we're especially grateful for our colleagues, Peter Ewell and Gary Pike and Katie Zabak, who have joined us to help us answer questions and attend to your individual needs and concerns. As I was preparing for some of these slides and working with Bonnie on getting the slides organized, I reflected back on some of my old lecture slides from having taught social research methods when I was a faculty member, and I realized that I had named this particular lecture Fun with Sampling. So we'll see if you all think that by the end of this. Becky, if you could advance to the next slide, that'd be great. What we're thinking about here is, in terms of what should sampling do overall, just to kind of get us all on the same page with sort of what the goal of what we're talking about. Anytime we're talking about developing samples, we're really talking about developing representation of a population, whatever that population is. Of course, in this case, a population of students. And that's, of course, so we can make statements about that population of students, extrapolate from any one sample to make larger inferences about a much larger group. And part of that is also being able to think about who goes into that population, thinking about how, or I guess more specifically, what representation actually means. And as you all know, being on your campuses, you know that it's very, even though we talk about students all the time as if they are some large homogeneous group, they're of course incredibly varied. So one of the things that makes this project complicated is identifying the students that we want to include in the sample, but also being attentive to the ways in which those students are different. Thinking about the ways in which they're going to vary by age, race, ethnicity, gender, transfer status, first-generation status, low-income status, making sure we have representation across majors and disciplines, wondering, the degree to which we should be representing Pell-eligible students. Some of those variations we've asked specifically for information on in the pilot, and we'll get to that in a few slides, what the actual characteristics of the sample might be. But at this point, just wanting to raise the point that we're aware that what makes this process complex on our campuses, that we are dealing with very different groups of students. And so leading to the third point on this slide is what we hope to inspire in this process in working with you all is that you will ask good questions, important and meaningful questions about who you want to be represented in any of the samples that you're collecting, knowing that it's a pilot study, knowing that the samples that you eventually collect will not be perfect, but that the questions you're asking now can be enduring, that those can be foundational for how you develop the sample over time and the sample process over time. Becky, we go to the next slide, please. So in keeping with that last point, one of the things that we've emphasized all along, and if any of you were able to join us for the webinar on just the overview of the pilot study that Bonnie and I did, and if you weren't able to join us for that, there's a link to listen to that recording. One of the things that we're emphasizing with the pilot itself is really the development of a process, for how we are engaging faculty, and development in a process for how we are developing intentional assignment design, and certainly a process for collecting and harvesting artifacts, and a process for uploading those to a national to a database that we can use for eventual scoring. So the fact that what we're trying to do in this particular webinar and this particular part of that overall pilot study is really hoping to allow you all to focus on the process as being the key part of it. And again, knowing that we're not going to develop the perfect sample on this go around, but wanting and hoping that we can lay good foundational practices for what can become the building blocks of a great process later on. And to do that, we have to think about what we're asking of you all. And so you see the emphasis placed in this next bullet point around development of a protocol for samples that are representative enough. We hope to give you the confidence and desire, more than anything, to keep moving the process forward. So we have set sample parameters that get at what we believe is at least a decent sample size to give you some confidence to move forward. With decent amounts of randomization, we have tried to build a process and give you guidelines and parameters that include some elements of randomization. It will not be a perfect random design. Very, very few sample designs are ever that, but at least including some elements of randomization that will help develop representation, and then providing those places too where we can nudge you to make sure that the samples are diversified enough to pick up the kinds of heterogeneity that you're dealing with on your campuses and getting at those different populations. Next slide, please. So again, going along with the idea of building a process, working together in what is a very large project, we think a big part of what we're doing with the sampling procedures that we're developing is in fact developing a reasonable set of expectations for how we're all, for our collective effort and making sure that all of us, whether it's at the institutional level, the state level, and the multi-state level, have a set of outcomes and success measures that we can all believe in and that are helpful to each one of us at all of those levels. So at the campus and state level, we have, I think, through the sampling subgroup, developed what I think are a reasonable set of expectations and guidelines that will, again, help lay the foundation for that process. And then with, again, as you see there, with reasonable levels of representation built in. And this third bullet point is actually the thing to point out most specifically, I think, on this slide, which is helping individual campuses through feedback that will come on sampling plans for building your own capacity for working through this process. We'll get to that feedback part in a little bit. It's also helping campuses to recognize, as you're engaged in the pilot study and in this process, recognizing where sources of bias in the sampling design might be coming from. Any good sampling design is always after representation and at the same time mitigating sources of bias. Who falls into the sample basically and who falls out of the sample, always being aware of who that is, knowing that any sample design isn't perfect. So really the best thing you can do as a researcher or as a campus representative undertaking this kind of project is to begin to recognize where those sources of bias might be. In the short time, you may or may not be able to do anything about those sources of bias, but it will be extremely important for our own collective efforts moving forward and for your individual efforts moving forward to be able to recognize where those sources of bias are coming from and hopefully get some feedback from us on maybe ways that you could work forward on improving those things. And I'll turn it over to Bonnie.
Good afternoon, everybody, and let me reiterate Ashley's thanks for taking your time out of the afternoon to join us for the webinar. Here on this slide, we have a glossary of terms, and we usually think it's good just to, even if they may seem obvious to some people, they're not always obvious to all of us, and part of being able to have conversation is to make sure we're using the terms in a similar way. So we've been talking a lot about, thus far Ashley's been talking a lot about the sampling process, and after we go through that process, we'll have our sample with all its perfections and imperfections. When we talk about a sample frame, we're really saying when you start with that larger population, your full population of eligible students, and then you're going to be trying to figure out who you want in that sample frame. What's your total list of students that you're then going to be able to draw your sample from? And that's where what Ashley was talking about in terms of research questions or who is it that you really want to look at means that that's going to try to define or help understand what you want to or what students you want to be including in that sample frame from which you're going to draw your samples. So in the Multistate Collaborative, we're trying to look at some of the characteristics in terms of one of the more important ones being major or area of study or program, but race, age, Pell eligibility are other characteristics we're collecting on the students. Other institutions, if they're looking at collecting larger samples, you may want to look at having students from different areas that, technical program versus non-technical program, for example, and that would have to do with your individual campus research questions. Also, once you have your sample frame, one of the questions we're going to be asking of you when you turn in your plans, your sampling plans, sampling process plans, is your intent to oversample from that sample frame. So you really do want to try to have a large enough sample frame list of students so that you can try to oversample to be ensure that you're going to be able to meet your minimum targeted sample. We use often element artifact, right? So the element that we're collecting is the artifact, and the artifact is the student work. So essentially, and Ashley's going to go through an example with you in a little bit, you're starting with your eligible population from which you funnel down into your sampling frame. Once you have that sampling frame, that's where you're going to draw your sample of students from, and then you're going to collect the elements. Next slide, please. So the population for the pilot study we've defined as students who've completed a minimum of 75% of their credits toward graduation. And that would be as of your census date, or some campuses call it a freeze date. Often that comes after your add-drop period for many institutions. So whenever you're going to choose that freeze date or that census date, then you want to be planning to go in and develop your sampling frame fairly soon after that process. Student work, once you know the students that you're going to be collecting artifacts from, you can collect that work at any time during the semester. So when the faculty member has student work that's ready, that can be submitted to the office. The key is that the work must be completed during the semester. Who's eligible? We have a list of eligibility down there, which you can read through, and they're also in the sampling protocols. But please, if you have questions about that, ask them. So we recently received a question from one of the campuses that said, we have students who have already completed a higher education degree, in some cases a bachelor's degree. They've returned to complete a two-year technical program. Should they be included or excluded? And so exclusion at this point would be what we'd be indicating so that we don't have a skewed sample. But down the road, that may be a research question an individual institution would like to look at. How are those individuals who have already completed a degree and returning back doing relative to your graduating seniors? So the next slide, please, Becky. Sample size. So you're targeted, now I've just lost my screen for a sec. Let me just see if I can pull it back up. Okay, so the targeted minimum, so there's been a lot of discussion about the minimum sample size, and we'll talk a bit about that. That's one of our frequently asked questions. But we've set a targeted minimum of 75 to 100 independent artifacts. So that means we're looking at really one outcome per artifact, and a faculty member may indicate that this artifact or this student work may be assessed against more than one outcome, but we're only going to use that artifact for one outcome. So in your sampling process, you'll have a protocol by which you determine with artifacts that have or can be assessed against two outcomes, how you'll determine which outcome that specific work will be assessed against. Where in order to get a degree of representation that Ashley was talking about, we'd want you to look to limit the number of artifacts that you're drawing from any one course or any one faculty member. So the larger the number of artifacts you're getting from one course, then the narrower your sample with respect to randomization or representation. And limit of one artifact per student, again for the same purpose of having a broad representative sample. Some of the institutions that are participating in a consortia structure within the state. So if you're participating in Massachusetts, our two-year campuses are participating in the consortia structure, and we have three groups of 3 to 4 institutions, and those institutions behave as one. So it's almost having one institution with different campuses. We want to encourage institutions that if they're oversampling and they're able to collect significantly more or more than their targeted minimum, that they do so, and we're encouraging that, and we're going to look to be sure that all artifacts that are collected and submitted will be scored. So next slide, Ashley.
Okay. So I think in my mind, and one of the things that when I think about sampling procedures, one of the thoughts that I always have is, it's all about a list. At the end of the day, a good sampling procedure And in many ways, good representation comes down to a really good list and who you get to ultimately who you ultimately get to be in the sample based upon that list. So this slide is really about finding a list and knowing that on many of your campuses you might start at that in different places. And so I'm sort of smiling a little bit at this follow-up question, how do we start the process of finding students? It seems kind of obvious and not hard, and then at the same time really difficult. So I think one of the things that makes that difficult, of course, is the practical reality of course, we have a giant list of students. Everybody has a giant list of students on their campus, but those also eventually have to be paired with a willing list of faculty. And knowing that you all might come at that from different directions. So one of the things that I think the sampling subgroup did a really terrific job of doing was acknowledging that you all might come at this from different starting points and different ways of thinking and different institutional cultures, quite frankly, of how it might be best to engage faculty in the process, or where it just simply makes sense for you to start. So what this slide is really about is just beginning to give you some options, beginning to think through with you what the process might look like. So for example, starting with that giant list of students, beginning to identify which of those students will be eligible for the pilot based on the slide that you just saw. Finding courses that contain where those students fall into, and then asking and recruiting faculty from those courses if they would like to participate. Another way to approach it would be to think about who are the faculty that are teaching the largest numbers of those eligible students already on campus, identifying the courses that are associated with those faculty, gaining, of course, and seeing if those faculty are then willing, of course, to participate, and then identifying the eligible students within those courses. Then the third option is maybe you already can identify a group or clustering of courses in which the highest number of those eligible students are falling into. That would be the easiest list to generate, and then work backwards from there to identify the faculty who teach those courses, seek their willingness to participate, and identify the eligible students in those courses. One of the things that we'll get to in just a moment is that even though you're identifying different lists along the way, there will still be elements of randomization when you get to the point at which you're identifying artifacts within a particular course, and so we can get to that in a moment. But again, this is just acknowledging there might be different starting points for all of you. The next slide, please, Becky. So this is one example of how that process might begin to fit together and this kind of goes in some ways back to one of the very first slide of putting together the sampling process and the sample frame, the elements and so forth, starting with the eligible student population, identified here the students who have completed 75% of credits towards graduation. The sampling frame in this example is identified courses, starting with a course list of students who are enrolled, and then with the willing faculty. And in this case, it sort of highlights the point that we actually have maybe two sampling frames going. We have a list of courses and then a list of students then that comes from those courses that you might actually engage the sampling process from. And the sampling process itself is what you see here in this next step where the randomization comes in. There's a simple random sample process that now, thanks to 21st century, you could just use a computer program to draw a list of basically random numbers. And the way to, of course, to think about simple random sampling is everybody falls into a hat and you're pulling names at random from the hat, sort of the computer version of that. Systematic sampling would be choosing names at some chosen interval. So every 5th case, every 10th name, something like that. And then as the next point says, consistent with what those sampling parameters are, up to a point in which you're not collecting more than 7 to 10 per faculty member, 1 artifact per outcome, one artifact per student. And then finally, the sample elements actually then ending up with what those artifacts would be for eventual de-identification and then uploading into the database. And next slide, please, Becky. So in this, and sort of breaking down what happens with those artifacts is not only pulling the artifacts and sending them on to what the database will hold, but then also assigning to those artifacts some basic characteristics. This is going back to the earlier point about representation and diversity within our student populations. These are the characteristics that we've pulled out for the pilot. And I guess the point to emphasize here is that these don't have to fully encompass what you might be interested in on your own campus. So again, thinking about if you also want to flag for your own purposes, transfer, first generation, any additional student level characteristics that, again, you might have a high population of veterans on your campus, for example. It could be one of a number of things, but that again is where you have the opportunity to ask questions about what other characteristics you might desire to have included in the sample, but those are the ones that we've identified for the pilot. And that's what the next point here says in terms of what you also might be interested in collecting for your own feedback. Probably, again, the most important thing on this slide is the right side of how what we expect will be, I guess we certainly hope will be helpful stages of development of your sampling plans. We have asked for initial drafts of the sampling plans to be due by June 9th, and that's so as a sampling subgroup we can offer feedback on those plans. We've developed a protocol or evaluation plan to give you very simple, straightforward feedback to each of the campuses. And then this final stage of having sampling plans due by July 20th. And then eventually, once the plans are implemented in the fall, having the opportunity to do some reflection on those plans and some gain follow-up information of how everything actually went and what might be opportunities to improve the process going forward. Next slide, please.
So we have documentation that we're going to be distributing to you and for helping you to report your sampling plans and submit them to us so they come, one, presented in a similar manner that will help us as reviewers give consistent feedback. But we'd like you to think about these not as much as sending in your sampling process for approval, but as reflective tools to help you begin to think about what are your sampling plans, what do you think this process is going to result in terms of what your sample is going to look like. Is our sampling plan going to be implementable? And that also says, okay, here we may have this wonderful sampling process set up, but then we look at some of the logistical factors involved, and we say, oh, I don't know if this is actually going to be doable for us at this point. How is your sampling process building in mechanisms to get diversity in your list of students that you ultimately end up with in your sample? And this becomes really important. When you generate that sample frame, you may already begin to be able to identify what kinds of biases are going to be reflected in your sample. And we expect that you're going to come up against sampling biases, particularly when we're looking at sample sizes of 75 to 100 relative to the size of the total eligible student population in many institutions. And what's important is that you begin to identify that bias, because as you're moving forward and looking at how to improve your sampling plans, that's going to come into play. That's something you want to be able to recognize in the improvement process. So there will be coming out. The sampling subgroup did take a little bit longer than we were hoping to develop the planning and evaluation tool, mostly because we wanted it to be a tool that was going to be helpful to you, as well as encompassing what we were going to be looking at in terms of evaluating and providing feedback. So you'll be getting that document probably early next week, given the long weekend. Next slide, Becky. So you get to stage 3, which we're really saying here stage 3 is after you've actually undertaken your sample. So you've got your sample, you've collected all your student artifacts, because we know when you generate that initial sample and you may go to collect a student artifact, the student maybe didn't show up for class that day, didn't complete that assignment, has disappeared from sites on the campus, and so then you're going to have to go back to a backup sampling plan, or having that sample list where you've oversampled will be really useful when you have different kinds of sources of attrition. So what we're asking you to do once you've collected all those artifacts is to go and now document your sampling process. So you want to, for both our purposes on this end, but also very much for your own purposes, is to identify what were the difficulties, how did you problem solve, or if we look when we get all these documents and we see very similar difficulties across a large number of institutions, then that can provide a starting point for us to problem solve in a more aggregate way. If you weren't able to get your targeted sample size, or if you exceeded your targeted sample size, you want to think about what either facilitated or helped you get that way, or really what was the impediments that you encountered. So was it that you the faculty that were instructing a large percentage of your students weren't ready to participate at this point, or weren't willing to participate? Were your faculty really willing to participate, but they didn't have an assignment for one of the outcomes that we're looking to assess? So the kinds of factors that come up that interfere with your sampling plans. And so then you're going to have that plan that you sent in, and this is where we want to know how you deviated. So when you're coming up against the barriers, when you're coming up against some impediments, or you're coming up and finding something really worked well, even though you didn't anticipate this or include it, you came upon it by accident, we'd like you to include that in your report back. What biases, we talked about that. What do you think you're going to be able to learn from the actual sample that you generated? And this next bullet is really important. We're actually going to ask you to look at the characteristics of your sample and compare that. Give us a little chart, and we'll send you a reporting document for stage 3 as well that compares your sample characteristics to the characteristics of your total eligible student population. And that's important, not as much at the institution level, because a lot of the work that we're doing with respect to any type of analysis really favors analysis at the multi-state level. So it'll give us a sense of the degree of representativeness as we aggregate up. And so then what did you learn? And typically we learned, I know in Massachusetts, we learned a tremendous amount from the pilot and the sampling process, and that led to plans for improvement. So again, the reporting documents that we're asking are also really designed to help you reflect upon your process. And one of the outcomes, when Ashley was talking about outcomes that we're hoping for institutions to gain from participating, is that they can develop a sampling process that they can scale and use down the road for their own individual institution assessment plans or projects. Next slide, Becky. So here are some of our frequently asked questions. So what if all the assignments come from only 1 or 2 departments? And again, that's where you want to, one, if there's nothing you can do to expand that sample pool, but therefore creating a large enough or attempting to create a large enough list within your sample frame can allow you to go back to do a second random sample to try to expand in areas where you think the current sample you drew is biased toward one department or another department. If you're unable to do that and you haven't been able to get beyond that, that's an important piece of information for you to have in terms of saying, do we need to have more professional development in order to have artifacts for these outcomes across a larger number of departments, or did it have to do with other factors? What if we can't gather 75 artifacts for one of the outcomes? This is a question that is common. I think that there's been a lot of concern about the ability of an institution or institutions to meet that targeted minimum. And having that targeted minimum be up in that range of 75 to 100, one is that we really want institutions to be trying to collect a large enough sample size so they can get some real insight into the viability of their process and the ability of that process to scale up. In order to identify any of the problems or the difficulties or the things that really worked well, you want to be able to be trying to collect a bit larger sample size than 25 where you wouldn't get those kinds of insights. If you want to look at trends in your institution data, then again, having a larger sample size will allow you to look at some trends where there's specific assumption, where there's specific descriptors in one of the rubric tools that our assignments didn't address across all of our departments. And so having a little bit larger sample size lets you look at those trends and also lets you compare to those trends to what we are seeing at the state and the multi-state level. So that's really looking at that targeted minimum. What if the assignment doesn't address all of the elements in the rubric? And I'm guessing that the assignment design webinar addressed that, but the more of the dimensions of the rubric that are covered, the better the picture we receive or we get with respect to the student's proficiency for that learning outcome. But we also recognize that some assignments don't lend themselves to addressing all of the elements in the rubric by the nature of the assignment. So we're asking through your professional development, when faculty are reflecting back on a current assignment or looking at redesigning, that they really think if they wanted that assignment, it was their intent to have that assignment address all the descriptors, and if so, have they designed those assignment instructions to elicit that response, or are there elements of that rubric that they hadn't thought about including that they could easily tweak that assignment instructions to include? And then what if the sample does not look at all like the total eligible student population? And again, that's where you're really beginning to think about representativeness. And so one of the things we want to encourage institutions to do as they're getting ready to think about, should we begin with the course, should we begin with faculty, should we begin with students, is there some background kinds of activities, some exploratory activities you can do to try to generate a population that looks a bit more like your total student population. And so you can look at what were the courses in which students in their senior year or their semester nearing graduation enrolled in. Do we see some patterns in terms of majors? Do we see some patterns in terms of age or other types of characteristics? Next slide. Thanks, Becky. And so if you have questions, who do you go to? So everybody has, every institution within a state, you have your state lead. So we're asking first and foremost that you can bring any of the questions you might have to the state lead. And in many cases, the state lead will be able to answer your question. If the state lead is not clear about answering the question, then they'll shift that question down to the sampling subgroup. This way we can also keep track of the questions coming in so that we can develop over time a broader list of frequently asked questions. And one of the other questions that have come up is the types of supports. What supports are out there if we're really not sure how to start? So we haven't sampled on our campus before, or we've really just started with a sample of convenience. We haven't thought about the sampling process, just collected artifacts from whatever faculty were willing to give them without any reference or any concern about randomness or representativeness, just to go through the process of scoring. So there are some available supports. One we'll be doing is making available sampling plans that have been approved as we go forward, so that you can look at the sampling plans of institutions that might be similar to you to have some idea. You also can look at letting your state lead know that you'd like to collaborate with other institutions either within your state or across states, and that can be facilitated through conference calls. And if your states are in proximity, such as Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, the institution leads in Massachusetts have asked if I'll reach out to the institution leads in Rhode Island and Connecticut so that they can have some conversations about sampling plans. So that brings us to the last slide, which just runs through the additional webinars that are going to be coming up. So we have a repeat of this webinar coming up tomorrow. We are doing two webinars, again, identical webinars on IRB and student consent, value rubrics. So we've had some questions about the value rubrics, their use, their development, and so we decided that it would be pretty helpful to go back and do a webinar on that. So we've had questions from people who have actually been using the value rubrics, and sometimes the more you use them, you start to generate different kinds of questions. And then what I'm expecting questions to come about at the end of this webinar has to do with the data management tool that we have. So we've adopted, AAC&U has chosen to use TaskStream as our data management system, and we'll be doing a webinar as well as providing some detailed information for coding, formatting, submitting your data. So that now turns it over to everybody for questions.
Hi, everyone. This is Rebecca Dolinsky again. So we have one question posted right now, so I'll read that out in just a minute. But before I do, I want to invite anyone else to please submit a question to the host directly or host and presenters, and we'll be sure to pose your questions in the order that we receive them. We have Katie and Peter online now, and we're going to unmute both of them. And I believe we have Gary too. We're not sure if he can contribute right now. We're working on that, but he is present on the webinar. So let's start off with the first question, and again, invite anybody else to submit further questions. So the one question we have right now is, how do we meet the limit of 7 to 10 artifacts per faculty member if we are seeking 200 to 300 artifacts?
This is Ashley. I can try to jump in on that. Obviously, what we're thinking about is expanding the number of identifying 20 to 30 faculty. So if you're thinking about a maximum of 10 per faculty member, then we were thinking initially recruiting, for example, 10 faculty per outcome is one way to think about it. And that's at least an initial thoughts about capacity building. I don't know, Bonnie or Peter or Katie, if they want to.
This is Peter. This is Peter. The general idea is to try to get as many faculty members in that sample as possible. So if you had a choice, if you will, of doing 10 artifacts for one faculty member, but you had enough willing that you could get 5 from each of 2 of them, that would be preferable. Basically, it's the upper limit. We're shooting for 7 on that for any given faculty member.
And one thing go ahead, Bonnie.
Oh, no, I was just going to say some of the institutions that I've been speaking with are including, doing just what Peter said, they're including as many faculty as they can, even if they're only able to get 1 or 2 artifacts from that faculty member. So it's probably a little bit more effort or time on the institution side to be collecting smaller number of artifacts per faculty member, but the more faculty you're able to include in the process, the greater sustainability you're going to build and move your own assessment programs further at a quicker pace.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That it's not only increases the validity of the sample, but it increases the participation on the campus of faculty members, and is really a professional development exercise.
Yeah. And we really are thinking. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. There was just one quick question there. It really is an upper limit of 10. It's 7 to 10, as the upper limit's 10 for faculty. Just to clarify.
And it looks like there's a follow-up point from that same person. So the follow-up point, that would be 30% of our total faculty without adjusting for faculty teaching foreign languages and other non-applicable courses.
So this is Bonnie. Again, you may run into some difficulty in achieving that minimum target, and that's really what we're asking you to identify, those difficulties. So to put in, if you will, a good faith effort so that you can begin to identify if there's specific areas where there aren't courses available, or for drawing samples out, if there's specific programs, or if of the available faculty, full-time and part-time faculty, we can't get enough willing faculty, then that tells you something different. So we do anticipate some institutions will have some difficulty reaching that targeted minimum. And we recognize that. Some institutions are concerned about doing the sampling in the fall semester because of the timing of when their students are going to be completing the requisite number of credits. Other institutions I've spoken with have said the fall semester is better for them. So we're trying, so there are always going to be limitations that are going to be working better or not so much for different institutions based on their own institutional constraints. And just one other quick factor is that some institutions are also choosing to or electing to collect all the artifacts from a willing faculty. So even if they may only be submitting 3 or 4 of the student work so that if a course only has 3 or 4 eligible students, they're collecting all of the coursework, because that gives them a greater pool of work to use on their own campus for different purposes. So that's one approach. The other concern that I've heard is if we only, if we tell the faculty member we only need the artifacts from these 4 eligible students, won't we then be somehow violating the confidentiality of the students? But you want to remember that you're developing your list and your sample frame from which you're sampling from. So faculty won't know whether the student's work that they submitted was included in the end sample or not.
Can I make a comment here? This is Peter. What you're really collecting as many artifacts as you can is always a good idea. And if it turns out that some of them are not, they don't meet the guidelines, you can probably use them for local purposes and be able to have a bigger sample from which we can draw. Also, we're going to be doing a two-stage selection process, if you will, in all of this. We'll review your sampling plans, give you feedback before you collect the data. You will then give us the results of how well it went. Even if it turns out that the results are not usable for the MSc, they're still going to be usable for you. So the sampling group may decide that institution X hasn't got a good enough sample to put everything in the pool, but they still are scoreable elements, and they will have been scored, and that's great. You can still use them locally.
So this is Becky speaking up. We have several questions in the queue, and I want to make sure we can try to get to all of them if possible. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is, so if there is a conflict between achieving the minimum number of artifacts and sticking to the constraints of the sampling plan, which takes priority?
This is Ashley. This question's been raised before. We really prefer you to collect a smaller number of artifacts and stick to the parameters that we've laid out in terms of sticking to the population that's identified. The last thing that we want to do is combine apples and oranges in the sample. That really complicates things. So we'd much rather, just as Peter was just saying, collect a smaller number of artifacts that still fit within the parameters.
Thanks, Ashley. I can move on to the next question unless anybody else would like to say anything.
Looks like Gary can come in by text, and he indicates that maybe you should form a consortium for those campuses that can't get enough. I agree with that.
Yeah, we can go to that little chat section now. I think folks can see all of that though, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you want to go up a little bit, Manka. Oh yeah, okay, so there's the first question. Okay, so someone is stating, I'm from a small school as well. We'll put in the good faith effort too, but at a 2-year school, it's hard to get students 75% of the way through during fall semester. I'll talk to my state point person about a consortium, and then Gary responded that your point about forming a consortium may be a sound strategy. And then the follow-up point from the same participant, good point that the artifacts are still usable at local levels, thanks. And that same participant had asked earlier about the upper limit of faculty number 7. Peter just said it's 7 or 10 in the slides, but that was already clarified earlier, so everyone knows that, again, it's 7 to 10 artifacts, right? So does any clarification there from anyone before we move to the next question?
Yeah, it is 7 to 10.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to move to, so there's a kind of 2-part question, I think. Manka, if you want to go to the Q&A function. Oh, she said, okay, that question's been answered, so we're good. Okay, so never mind on that one. All right, so how about this one? This is, so this person says, I have 2 concerns, not necessarily questions. 1, particularly regarding quantitative literacy, the courses which have appropriate assignments which seniors would be taking are likely to overrepresent certain majors, hence students, and underrepresent others. 2, given that our faculty are not all present during the summer, I may have a plan which is challenging to implement once the faculty are consulted more than may be possible now.
So, oh, go ahead, Peter.
Well, just regarding the second one, I think that it would be wise for every participating campus to, like, as soon as possible, like this afternoon, get out an APB to the faculty saying, we're participating in this. You'll hear more about it later, but this is just a heads up.
Yeah.
So in some of the, this is Bonnie, in some of the timeline documents, the communication with your campuses, we're hoping is going on right now. With respect to the sampling plan, once it comes in the fall, there are different campus cultures, if you will. So some campuses have said, you know, our faculty are not at all going to be really concerned or want to know a lot of detail about the sampling process. At other campuses, that may not be so. So if you have to make adjustments to that sampling process because of the feedback, hopefully early, that you're able to do that early in September, then you can run those adjustments in your sampling process back by the sampling subgroup, or be sure to note the deviation in your plan in your reporting after you've implemented sampling, so that you have a deviation from what you implemented from what you planned because faculty XXX. So I think that is one way to handle that. And with respect to the bias, I think a lot of campuses will see a similar type of bias with the quantitative literacy outcome. And that, again, raises a question for many campuses. Is quantitative literacy an institution-level outcome if we only see it being addressed in very specific majors or programs? Or is it only addressed, and this is more relevant for 4 years, is it only addressed in your general education or your core, and then it's not reinforced except for disciplines that lend themselves more to quantitative literacy? So I think that's a bias we recognize, and then you try to understand where's that bias coming from.
Well, and what's it doing to you? I think that
right.
Basically that effect is going to be probably quite clear on many campuses, that the artifacts that you're going to get in quantitative literacy will be upper bound estimates of the actual ability, because you've got people who have never gotten the chance to demonstrate it because they haven't taken a course. I mean, that's both, as Bonnie said, that's a data point in and of itself for you for curriculum review, but it also qualifies the result and says these are people who had the opportunity to do it, and it probably is going to be overestimating the actual ability level across the population. The second thing that I think you have to bear in mind is that you really should be looking for quantitative literacy artifacts with casting a wide net. I mean, hopefully you've got capstones in sociology that may be able to demonstrate quantitative literacy, or pharmacy, or whatever it might happen to be. There's the natural tendency to think, well, these all ought to be mathematics courses, and they emphatically should not be.
Yeah. There's also great work to draw from. I think Massachusetts has done some great work around this. Bonnie, correct me if I'm wrong, but Holyoke Community College has some great leadership around this issue. So there are opportunities, maybe people within the pilot to reach out to of how this has been addressed on other campuses. So there's a big vision out there for how this can be done.
Yes, Ashley, this is Bonnie. That's correct. We have Holyoke Community College in Massachusetts has done a lot of professional development around that. But given the time frame, you may not be able to do that. But as Peter said, you can begin to identify areas such as health, such as our history, even where we may not expect to, but they may have assignments very much that could be assessed for quantitative literacy. So part of that is the conversations that you may not be able to have with those faculty until September, and that may help you to determine your sample frame.
So we had one more webinar participant who had submitted a question, but then followed up by saying that her question has already been answered. So we're good there, and otherwise I think we're all set with the Q&A portion of the webinar, unless the panelists would like to close with any thoughts.
This is Peter. Maybe I will. I'm going to try to express this at the next webinar as well. But despite these limits of X number per faculty member per only a couple any of these numeric limits, your absolute best sample would be 75 artifacts from. It's not going to happen, but 75 artifacts from 75 different faculty members across 75 different courses. I mean, that's sort of the ideal you're shooting for, and the question is, how close can you get?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will, of course, be running the exact same webinar tomorrow and opening up to other participants to ask Q&A. To ask questions about the sampling procedures for the MSc pilot study. Bonnie already went over the additional MSc webinars that are coming up. We'd like to also invite you to check out the webinars that have been posted, that have already been hosted, which was the Welcome to the MSc webinar, the Pilot Study Overview webinar, and a webinar on assignment design. And just a quick FYI, we're working on posting that last one right now. So that should be up soon. We just got a last-minute question about when we'll be getting invitations to the IRB webinar. Actually, that should be coming out pretty shortly. In fact, our colleague Gloria over at SHIO was putting that together today, so y'all should be getting that invitation very soon. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.